the Galactic Nightmare Commission declared human folklore the scariest stories known. Part 1. The Commission chamber floated in the void between stars, a massive sphere of crystalline walls that refracted light from a dozen nearby suns. Inside, representatives from 9 different species sat in their specialized environmental pods, waiting for the session to begin. This was the Galactic Nightmare Commission, and they met once every 1,000 years to catalog and assess the most terrifying folklore from across known space. Chief Investigator stood at the center of the chamber. Their crystalline body caught the light and split it into rainbow patterns across the floor. Had been doing this job for 6, studying the nightmares and horror stories of countless civilizations. They were very good at their job, which meant very little could surprise them anymore. "We begin the assessment," announced, their voice transmitted through frequency waves that each species translator converted into comprehensible sound. The delegation maintains the primary classification. Their Void Stalker mythology continues to represent the highest measured psychological impact across species. In one of the pods, the representative pulsed with dark purple light, clearly pleased. For 3,000 years, their folklore had held the top position. The Void Stalkers were entities that unmade reality itself, erasing not just individuals but the very concept that they had ever existed. It was existentially terrifying to most species, hitting primal fears about meaning and memory. "However," continued, "we have a new applicant for assessment. The humans have applied for Galactic Council membership, and as per protocol, they must submit their folklore for evaluation." A door materialized in the chamber wall and a human walked through. She was small compared to most of the species present, wearing a simple black suit and carrying a leather bag. Her name was Dr. Sarah, and she was Earth's ambassador. She looked around the chamber with dark eyes that missed nothing, then walked to the center platform beside. "Doctor," said formally, "you understand that this assessment is mandatory for all species seeking council membership. We must understand the psychological framework of your species through your cultural nightmares. Please present your submission." Sarah nodded and set her bag on the platform. She pulled out an old leather-bound book and a small tablet. "I've brought a representative sample," she said. "I thought we'd start with something simple, children's stories." A ripple of confusion went through the chamber. The representative, a being of organized gas held together by an electromagnetic field, fluctuated with curiosity. Children's stories. What did those have to do with nightmare folklore? "We'll begin with a tale called Hansel and," Sarah said, opening the book. She began to read in a calm, steady voice. The story started simply enough. 2 children lived with their father and stepmother. The family was poor and had very little food. So far, nothing unusual. Many species had stories about hardship and survival. Then Sarah reached the part where the stepmother convinced the father to abandon the children in the forest. The commission members listened more carefully now. Abandonment by parental figures triggered instinctual distress in most species, but humans told this to their children. The story continued. The children found a house made of candy and cake. They were hungry, so they started eating it. Then the owner came out. She was a witch who had built the house specifically to lure children. She captured Hansel, locked him in a cage, and began fattening him up, because she intended to cook and eat him. The representatives suddenly fluctuated wildly, their containment field wobbling. "Clarification needed," they transmitted. "This entity consumes its own species young." "Oh no," Sarah said pleasantly. "The witch isn't human. Well, not really, she's something else that looks human. But yes, she eats children, that's her whole thing." "And this is a children's story?" asked the representative, their crystalline structure developing tiny stress patterns. "A bedtime story," Sarah confirmed. "We tell it to children before they sleep, though it ends well. The sister pushes the witch into her own oven and burns her alive. Then the children steal all the witch's jewels and go home rich." made a note on their data pad. This was unusual but not yet alarming. They had encountered species with harsh folklore before. Continue with your next selection. Sarah smiled and turned a page. This one's called Little Red Riding Hood. A young girl is walking through the forest to visit her sick grandmother. She meets a wolf who asks where she's going. The story seemed simpler than the last one, almost gentle. The girl told the wolf where she was going and the wolf ran ahead. But when the girl reached her grandmother's house, something was wrong. Her grandmother looked strange. Her eyes were wrong. Her ears were too large. Her teeth were too big. Because it wasn't her grandmother anymore, Sarah explained. The wolf had eaten the grandmother and put on her clothing. It was wearing her nightgown and cap, lying in her bed, pretending to be her. The chamber fell silent. The concept hit every species present in a deep, primal way. A predator that could perfectly mimic a loved one. A threat that hid inside the appearance of safety and family. The wolf then ate the girl too, Sarah added. In the original version, that's where it ends. In later versions, a huntsman cuts open the wolf's belly and rescues them both. But the core message remains, the danger that wears a familiar face. The representative pulsed with interest. Fascinating. The psychological impact of trust betrayal combined with predator mimicry. What age demographic receives this story? Children age 3 to 7 typically, Sarah said. 3. The representative's field destabilized slightly. Your species introduces existential predator fear during early development. We have a lot of these stories, Sarah said. She pulled up her tablet and scrolled through a list. There's Bluebeard, about a wealthy man who marries women and then murders them, keeping their bodies in a locked room. There's the Juniper Tree, where a stepmother decapitates her stepson and cooks him into a stew that she feeds to his father. There's the Girl Without Hands, where a father cuts off his daughter's hands. There's Stop raised one crystalline appendage. Their internal structure was showing visible stress fractures now. These are all designated as children's stories. Well, fairy tales, Sarah clarified. Though yes, they're primarily told to children. These are from the Brothers Grimm collection, published in 1812. They're pretty standard across human cultures, though each region has variations. These are just the European ones. Variations. His voice carried a frequency that their translator rendered as dismay. You're saying different human cultures independently developed similar psychological terrorism for children. Sarah looked confused. Terrorism? No, these are teaching stories. Hansel teaches children not to trust strangers who offer candy. Little Red Riding Hood teaches them that danger can look safe. Bluebeard teaches young women to trust their instincts about dangerous men, their survival information. Encoded in nightmare format, the noted. Well, they have to be memorable, Sarah said reasonably. Children won't remember a lecture, but they'll remember a story about a wolf dressed as grandma. Made several more notes, their appendages moving faster now. How many of these stories exist in human culture? Sarah checked her tablet. I brought about 300 samples with me, but the actual number is difficult to calculate. Tens of thousands, probably, if you include regional variations and modern adaptations. Tens of thousands, repeated the number as if testing its reality, and these are the sanitized children's versions. Mostly the Brothers Grimm versions, yes. The originals are darker. Would you like to hear one of those? The chamber filled with a chaotic mix of transmissions as all 9 species tried to process what they were hearing. They were developing cracks in their crystalline matrices. They were fluctuating erratically. Even the seemed unsettled. Raised their appendages for silence. I am calling this session to recess. We need to analyze what we've heard before continuing. Doctor, please transmit your full database to our research division. Sure, Sarah said. She tapped her tablet. Sending now. Just so you know, those are just fairy tales. I also brought samples of our urban legends, horror literature, and modern folklore. I wasn't sure what you'd want to start with. The Asked Weekly. Horror stories created and shared through our internet, Sarah explained. Collaborative nightmare building. Some of them spread across our whole planet in a matter of days. We make them up for fun. Looked at the data transmission bar on their display. It was still moving, showing the size of the file Sarah had just sent. 300 stories. 300 carefully curated samples of humanity's mildest nightmare fuel, the things they told to small children at bedtime. Session adjourned, announced. We reconvene in 3 days. As Sarah packed up her book and tablet, she noticed the other species were all staring at her. Not with hostility, exactly. More like the way someone might stare at a venomous creature they just realized was much more dangerous than they'd assumed. She smiled politely and left the chamber, completely unaware that in those few minutes, she had fundamentally altered the Galactic Council's entire understanding of humanity. Behind her, Chief Investigator looked at their fellow commission members. I have been evaluating nightmare folklore for 6,000 years, they said quietly. I have never seen anything like this. They tell these stories to children. They create new ones constantly, and they consider this normal. The representative pulsed with dark light. Our void stalkers unmake existence itself. Surely that is still more terrifying than human fairy tales. But was reading through the transmitted files, scanning titles. The Pied Piper of who stole all the children from a town, who demanded a firstborn child as payment. The little match girl who froze to death while hallucinating warmth, with its casual mutilations and deaths presented in cheerful rhyme. I don't know, said slowly. I genuinely don't know anymore. Part 2. For 3 days, the research division of the Galactic Nightmare Commission worked without rest. Well, those species that required rest took minimal amounts of it. The others worked continuously, analyzing the database that Dr. Sarah had transmitted. Chief Investigator stood before the commission chamber once again, but this time they looked different. Their crystalline body, normally a clear blue-white, had developed darker inclusions. Stress markers, in 6,000 years of nightmare research, had never shown visible stress markers. I have compiled our preliminary findings, began. The situation is significantly more complex than initial assessment suggested. The chamber filled with the attentive silence of 8 species waiting for an explanation. Doctor sat in a guest pod, ready to answer questions. She had brought coffee this time. A human beverage she'd mentioned helped her think clearly. The fact that humans needed chemical stimulants to maintain cognitive function had sparked an entirely separate research thread. The primary issue, continued, is not content alone. Many species have violent or disturbing folklore. The issue is cultural context and implementation. Activated the central display. It showed a human family group, animated reconstructions based on cultural data. Human children receive these stories beginning at approximately age 2 standard years. The stories are delivered by trusted parental figures, often in comfortable settings before sleep. The stories are frequently repeated throughout childhood and adolescence. This is psychological conditioning, the representative observed. Systematic exposure to threat scenarios during development. That was our initial conclusion as well, agreed. But the reality is more nuanced. Doctor, would you explain the concept of fairy tale therapy? Sarah set down her coffee and stood. Of course. Child psychologists have found that fairy tales help children process complex emotions and fears in safe contexts. The symbolic nature of the stories allows children to confront ideas like death, abandonment, and betrayal without being overwhelmed. It's developmental scaffolding. Scaffolding for what? Asked the representative. For living in reality, Sarah said simply. Our world is dangerous. Bad things happen. People sometimes hurt each other. Children need to understand these concepts to develop appropriate caution and emotional resilience. Pulled up another display. This brings us to our second finding. Human fairy tales are not geographically isolated. Doctor mentioned European tales, but we have now analyzed samples from across Earth. The display showed a map of Earth with highlighted regions. Japanese culture has an entire category of stories called tales. These feature everyday objects that gain sentience and malevolence after 100 years of existence. Your umbrella might develop a tongue and eye. Your teapot might grow legs and chase you. Sarah nodded. It teaches children to respect objects and not be wasteful. Chinese folklore includes stories like The Woman in the Wall, where a murdered concubine's body is sealed in a wall and her spirit haunts the household. Korean folklore has a nine-tailed fox that disguises itself as a beautiful woman to seduce and devour men. African cultures have the Ads, a vampiric being that can transform into a firefly to enter homes and drink children's blood. The chamber absorbed this information with growing unease. Every human culture, emphasized, independently developed elaborate nightmare folklore. The specific manifestations vary, but the underlying patterns are consistent. Trusted figures that betray, predators that mimic safety, invisible threats, corruption of the familiar, and all of it is transmitted to children as cultural education. The representative pulsed. This suggests a species-wide psychological characteristic. Humans are naturally predisposed to paranoia and threat modeling. That was our third finding, said. Doctor, please explain Earth's classification. Sarah pulled up her own tablet. Earth is what classify as a Class 7 death world. High gravity, aggressive microbial life, extreme weather variations, megafauna predators, and a remarkable number of things that want to eat, poison, or otherwise kill you. Humans evolved as persistent hunters on a planet where they were simultaneously apex predators and prey, added. They had no natural armor, no venomous capabilities, no overwhelming physical advantages. Their evolutionary edge was cognitive, the ability to imagine threats that didn't exist, prepare for scenarios they had never encountered, and transmit survival information through narrative. The representative fluctuated with confusion. But humans no longer live in that environment. They have advanced technology, controlled habitats, medical science. Why maintain the nightmare folklore? Because we're still human, Sarah said quietly. Our technology is only a few hundred years old. Our psychology is hundreds of thousands of years old. We still have the same brains, the same instincts. The scary stories keep us sharp. Pulled up a new display. This one showed charts and graphs. This leads to our most disturbing finding. Humans do not only maintain ancient folklore, they actively create new nightmare material. Doctor, please explain. Sarah took a sip of her coffee. In the early 21st century, humans developed global digital communication networks. We immediately started using them to create and share scary stories. Refers to short horror stories and pasted across the internet. They spread like wildfire. Give them examples, said. Well, there's Jeff the Killer, about a teenager who becomes a disfigured murderer. The Rake, a humanoid creature that watches people sleep. Smile Dog, a haunted image that drives people insane. Ben Drowned, a ghost haunting a video game. SCP Foundation, a collaborative project documenting fictional supernatural objects and entities that has thousands of entries. Sarah pulled up her tablet and showed images. The commission members recoiled. The pictures showed deliberately disturbing imagery, uncanny valley faces, unsettling creatures. Humans create these voluntarily, the representative asked, for entertainment. For fun, Sarah confirmed. Horror is one of our most popular entertainment genres. We have books, movies, video games, podcasts, all dedicated to scaring ourselves. Some of our most celebrated artists are horror creators. Stephen King, H.P. Edgar. Interrupted, explain cosmic horror. Sarah's expression became more serious. Cosmic horror is that focuses on the existential terror of humanity's insignificance. It presents the universe as vast, cold, and filled with entities so powerful and alien that even knowing they exist can drive you insane. The horror comes from the realization that we don't matter, that our understanding of reality is limited, and that there are things out there we were never meant to comprehend. The chamber fell silent. The representative finally spoke. That is remarkably similar to our Void Stalker mythology. Yes, Sarah said, except we made ours up deliberately as entertainment less than 200 years ago. Wrote his first stories in the 1920s. Now cosmic horror is an entire genre with thousands of works. Displayed another chart. The Commission requested access to the human internet to analyze contemporary folklore. We have found active communities dedicated to creating, refining, and sharing nightmare content. The no-sleep community has millions of participants. The true crime genre, where humans obsessively study real murders and disasters, is wildly popular. Humans spend billions of their currency units annually on horror entertainment. We wanted to understand why, continued. So we conducted psychological studies on human test subjects. We exposed them to frightening stimuli and measured their responses. The results were unlike anything in our database. The display showed brain scans and physiological data. When humans experience fear in controlled circumstances, such as reading a scary story or watching a horror movie, they show increased dopamine and adrenaline production. The fear response triggers pleasure centers. They literally enjoy being frightened. It's the roller coaster effect, Sarah explained. The thrill of fear when you know you're actually safe. It's exciting. But it has functional benefits beyond pleasure, said. Humans exposed to regular controlled fear stimuli show increased stress resilience, better threat recognition, and more adaptive problem-solving skills in crisis situations. The nightmare folklore is not just cultural transmission, it is psychological training. The representative pulsed thoughtfully. So human children who grow up with these stories are being conditioned for high-stress environments. We're being prepared for life, Sarah corrected. You have to understand, Earth isn't some peaceful paradise. We still have natural disasters, diseases, accidents, violence. Bad things happen and humans need to cope with them. Scary stories teach emotional regulation and resilience. Pulled up a final display. This one showed comparative data across species. After analyzing the full human submission, the Commission has reached a preliminary conclusion. Human folklore represents the highest measured psychological impact across species. The combination of systematic childhood exposure, continuous cultural creation, and species-wide psychological adaptation creates a nightmare framework unlike anything previously documented. However, continued, and their frequency carried something that might have been concern, we have identified a potential issue. The Commission exists to catalog nightmares as a defensive measure. Understanding what frightens each species helps us develop protocols for psychological warfare, defense, and relations. The problem with humans, the representative said, their voice resonating through the chamber, is that your nightmares are contagious. Sarah blinked. What? Gestured at the assembled species. 3 days ago, none of us had heard of Hansel and or Little Red Riding Hood. Now, half of us are experiencing recurring intrusive thoughts about the scenarios you described. The research team had to stop analyzing your horror literature because their containment fields were destabilizing. 2 researchers have developed permanent stress fractures. Even I have been experiencing degraded rest cycles. We shared your internet with a test subject, they added quietly. They entered a catatonic state for 12 hours after viewing the smile dog image. Sarah looked genuinely distressed. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. You didn't do anything wrong, interrupted. This is simply data, but it raises serious questions about human integration into the galactic community. Your species carries mimetic hazards as casual cultural content. We need to determine whether humans can be safely admitted to the Council, or whether you represent a psychological contamination risk. The chamber fell silent. Sarah stood alone in the center, suddenly aware that humanity's entry into galactic civilization might be because their bedtime stories were too scary. "I request permission to present additional context," Sarah said formally. "I believe there's something important you're not considering." Gestured acceptance. "Proceed." Sarah took a deep breath. "You're thinking about human folklore as if it's disconnected from reality, like we just made up scary stories for no reason, but that's not accurate." She pulled up her tablet and displayed an image of Earth, rotating slowly. "Every one of our scary stories is based on something real. The Brothers Grimm collected folklore from the 1800s during a period of extreme poverty, famine, and child mortality. Children were abandoned in forests because families couldn't feed them. People did starve to death. Wolves did attack humans." More images appeared. "Our vampire legends emerged in regions experiencing plague outbreaks. Our ghost stories often encode genuine tragedies. Our monster tales describe real predators, real dangers, real threats our ancestors faced." Sarah's voice grew quieter but more intense. "You keep asking why we tell these stories to children. It's because they're survival information. Every culture on Earth independently developed this system because it works. The scary stories kept us alive." Absorb this information, their crystalline structure refracting the light in new patterns. "You're saying human folklore is an evolutionary adaptation, a survival mechanism." "Yes," Sarah said, "and it's still functioning. You said our nightmares are contagious, that other species find our stories psychologically impactful. That's exactly what they're designed to do: stick in your memory, make you cautious, keep you thinking about potential threats." She looked around the chamber at the assembled species. "You're treating our folklore like it's some kind of weapon, but from our perspective, it's armor. It's how we learned to survive on a death world where everything wanted to kill us. And now you're wondering if we're safe to integrate into galactic society," Sarah continued. "If our psychological framework is too dangerous, too contaminating." She smiled, and it was not a happy expression. "But maybe you should be asking a different question. If humans survived everything our folklore describes, and we're still creating new scary stories, what exactly are we preparing for next?" The commission members looked at each other, their various forms of communication creating a web of confused transmissions across the chamber. Finally, the representative spoke. "What are you preparing for?" Sarah's smile widened slightly. "Everything," she said. "Absolutely everything, because that's what humans do. We imagine the worst possible thing that could happen and then we figure out how to survive it. That's not a bug in our psychology. That's the feature that kept us alive." Made a note on their data pad, but their appendages were shaking slightly. The commission would need more time to process this. Much more time. Part 3. The Galactic Council Chamber was larger than the Nightmare Commission facility, a vast space station that housed the representatives of 73 different species. Today, it was filled to capacity. Word had spread about the human situation, and everyone wanted to see how the council would rule. Dr. Sarah stood at the center of the chamber, alone under lights that came from a dozen different stars filtered through the station's dome. Around her, in their various environmental pods and platforms, the representatives of galactic civilization watched and waited. Ambassador of the collective spoke first. Their species communicated through color patterns across their bioluminescent skin, translated into audible speech by their pod systems. "Doctor, humanity's application for council membership has been suspended pending review of the Nightmare Commission's findings. Do you understand the severity of the situation?" "I do," Sarah said quietly. "The Commission has classified human folklore as a Level 9 psychological hazard," continued. "The highest classification possible. Your species' cultural content has caused measurable psychological harm to trained researchers. 2 species have requested that humans be quarantined, until we can determine whether your presence represents a memetic contamination risk to galactic civilization. Sarah had known this was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud still hurt. Humanity had spent 2 centuries developing faster-than-light travel, reaching the stars, preparing for this moment. And now they might be turned away because their fairy tales were too scary. "I would like to address the council," Sarah said formally. Colors shifted to indicate acceptance. "You may speak." Sarah had prepared for this moment, but now she set aside her notes. This needed to come from the heart. "Honorable representatives, I understand your concern. After reading the Commission's report, I understand why you're afraid of us, but you're looking at this wrong." Murmurs of translation filled the chamber as species conferred with each other. The Nightmare Commission concluded that human folklore is uniquely dangerous because it's pervasive, self-replicating, and psychologically impactful across species, Sarah continued. "You're right. Our stories are all of those things, but you're treating them like weapons when they're actually tools." She pulled up her tablet and displayed an image on the central screen. It showed a human child, maybe 5 years old, sitting on an adult's lap while the adult read from a book. This is how most humans first encounter our folklore. A parent or guardian reads us a story. We're safe, we're comfortable, and we trust the person reading to us. The image changed to show the same child a few years older, reading alone by flashlight. As we get older, we seek out scary stories ourselves. We read them at sleepovers. We tell them at summer camps. We watch horror movies with our friends. It becomes a social bonding experience. "But why?" The question came from Representative, who had been invited to address the council. "Why do humans voluntarily seek out psychological distress?" "Because it makes us stronger," Sarah said simply. "Humans call it stress inoculation. When you expose yourself to manageable amounts of stress in controlled environments, you build resilience. You learn how to cope with fear. You practice emotional regulation." She changed the image again. This time it showed brain scans. The Commission's research confirmed this. Humans who regularly engage with horror fiction show better stress response, improved threat assessment, and faster recovery from traumatic events. Our scary stories are literally training our brains to handle real danger better. The representative pulsed with dark light. "This still does not address the central concern. Your folklore is contagious. It affects other species negatively. How can we permit humans into the council when your mere presence might cause psychological harm?" Sarah took a deep breath. This was the crucial moment, because you're already in danger and you don't even know it. The chamber fell silent. "What danger?" demanded. Sarah pulled up new data on the screen. She'd spent the past 3 days coordinating with Earth's research divisions, and what they'd found was concerning. The Commission's research revealed something interesting. They tested human folklore on multiple species and found it had varying but consistent psychological impact. They concluded this meant our stories were hazardous, but they missed the real pattern. The screen showed graphs comparing different species' responses to various human stories. "Look at what actually frightened you." They were most disturbed by stories involving betrayal and corruption of trusted figures. They were most affected by tales of invisible threats and atmospheric horror. They responded strongly to cosmic horror and existential themes. She highlighted the patterns. Each species responded most strongly to threats that targeted their specific psychological vulnerabilities. Human folklore isn't just scary, it's comprehensively scary. It covers every category of threat that any sapient species might fear. "This proves our point," said. "Your species has developed directional psychological hazards." "Or," Sarah countered, "my species has developed comprehensive threat modeling. We haven't just imagined every category of horror. We've faced most of them and survived." She changed the display to show Earth's history. The Commission noted that human folklore is based on reality. Let me be more specific about what that means. Humans evolved on a death world where the average was 30 years. We faced predators, diseases, natural disasters, and hostile environments. Images flashed across the screen: saber-toothed cats, plague victims, volcanic eruptions, ice ages. We developed folklore about monsters in the dark because there were monsters in the dark. We created stories about disease and corruption because we watched plague turn our neighbors into violent, delirious versions of themselves. We told tales about environmental catastrophe because we survived extinction events. The chamber was listening intently now. But we didn't just survive by being physically tough, Sarah continued. We survived by being psychologically adaptive. Our ancestors developed the ability to imagine threats they'd never encountered, to prepare for scenarios they'd never experienced. This is why our folklore is so comprehensive. We had to be ready for everything. She paused, then dropped the hammer. And now I need to tell you something that the Commission discovered but hasn't yet reported to this council. Doctor, would you confirm my next statement? His crystalline body refracted the light nervously. Yes, proceed. Sarah pulled up new data. Over the past 3 days, Earth's Xenobiology Research Division analyzed the Commission's reports on galactic species' psychological vulnerabilities. We cross-referenced them with our folklore database. The results are disturbing. The screen showed a complex matching algorithm. Human folklore contains specific, detailed threat scenarios that target the psychological weaknesses of every species in this chamber. Not just general fears, specific ones. The fear sensory isolation. We have stories about people trapped in silence and darkness. The fear loss of collective consciousness. We have tales about hive minds being corrupted or destroyed. The fear temporal paradox. We have entire genres dedicated to time travel horror. She looked around the chamber. This isn't a coincidence. The Commission assumed human folklore affected you because it's psychologically potent. But the truth is deeper. Human folklore affects you because humans have already imagined in detail the specific nightmares that scare you most. How is this possible? Asked. Humans had no contact with our species until recently. How could you develop folklore that targets our specific fears? Because, Sarah said quietly, at a fundamental level, all sapient species share similar vulnerabilities. We fear betrayal because trust is necessary for social species. We fear invisible threats because we all rely on imperfect senses. We fear corruption of the familiar because we all need stability to function. Human folklore is comprehensive because we imagined every possible threat, and it turns out those threats are universal. Spoke up, their voice resonating through the chamber. There is an additional finding that Doctor is too modest to mention. During our research, we attempted to create counter-scenarios, hypothetical threats that humans had not already imagined in their folklore. We failed. Every scenario we created, humans had already explored in some form of their cultural nightmares. We tried to imagine a threat type that would surprise humans, the representative added. A scenario that would psychologically impact them the way their stories impact us. We could not. Their folklore has prepared them for everything we could conceptualize. Sarah nodded. This is what I meant when I said you're looking at this wrong. Yes, human folklore can cause psychological distress to other species. But that's because humans have already mapped the entire terrain of possible nightmares. We've imagined every threat, and more importantly, we've developed coping mechanisms for all of them. She changed the display one final time. This showed historical data, news reports, crisis responses. When a plague hit Earth in 2020, humans didn't panic. We had folklore about plagues going back thousands of years. We knew what to do. When our first AI systems showed unexpected behavior, we had already written hundreds of stories about rogue artificial intelligence. We had frameworks for thinking about it. When we discovered faster-than-light travel might have exotic side effects, we had cosmic horror literature to help us conceptualize the risks. You're saying human folklore is predictive? Asked. I'm saying it's preparatory, Sarah corrected. We don't predict specific threats. We imagine all possible threats so that when a real one appears, we're psychologically ready for it. She took a breath. And this brings me to why you should approve Humanities Council membership, not despite our folklore, but because of it. The chamber waited. You've been studying our scary stories for 3 days, Sarah said. In that time, how many new potential threats have you identified? How many scenarios have you considered that you hadn't thought of before? Silence answered her. The Commission's report mentioned that half the researchers experienced recurring intrusive thoughts about human folklore scenarios, Sarah continued. Those intrusive thoughts, that's your brain trying to prepare for threats it hadn't considered before. Human folklore isn't psychological contamination. It's psychological vaccination. We're training your minds to recognize and cope with threat patterns. The representative pulsed slowly. You believe other species will benefit from exposure to human nightmare frameworks. I know they will, Sarah said, because that's what nightmares are for. They're simulations, safe spaces to experience and prepare for danger. You're disturbed by our folklore because it's working. It's making you think about threats you'd rather ignore. She gestured to the assembled council. You've built a peaceful civilization spanning dozens of star systems. That's remarkable, but peace requires preparation. You need to imagine what could go wrong in order to prevent it. Humans are very, very good at imagining what could go wrong. Ambassador's colors shifted through a complex pattern. Even if we accept your premise, there remains the issue of psychological harm. Several researchers experienced severe distress. Because they weren't prepared, Sarah.